first part of this lecture, the third one in the series, I would like to map the field. When you're invited to play on a field, it's important, if it's a soccer field or a tennis court or a cricket field, it's important to know who are the other players, what is the field like, what are the rules, what are the tools, who's the audience, who's the ref. We realize that the schemas we use up to now doesn't provide us with enough guidance or with clear enough guidance, or our social mores and norms have changed. There's increasingly alliances that talk back. The global south talks back to the global north and say your ethics are not ours and our ethics are not yours. The third element in this field that I think that we need to take care of is the issue of globalization and internationalization, where local and global intersects and where there's different contestations and disconnections, where we look for local solutions to globally produce problems, while global frameworks on ethics try to provide guidance on local issues. The fourth issue is we're living in a networked, but also in a networking world, where networks don't only include, but also exclude. The fifth point is the rising inequalities. We cannot disregard the increasing inequality in the world. And how does ethics guide us to negotiate our way through this? And the last point in this field that I would like to map now is the fluidness of it all, our insecurities, our fluid securities, our fragile privacy, and as we define who's in our network, who's out. What are the ethical issues then in higher education? If this is a broader context, what are the ethical issues in higher education? Let's now look at specific trends in higher education. The first factor that I think that is increasingly impacting on the choices we have and the scope of our ethical responsibility is the impact of technology. The second trend that I think we need to take cognizance of is changes in funding and regulatory environment. How does that and how do they impact on the choices we have and the constraints we face? The third impact specifically with regard to ethics in higher education is the role of higher education in broader society and the need to massify or the massification of higher education. The fourth trend is the role and the impact and the variety of stakeholders that is playing on this field with their different claims and their programs. The fifth trend we're quickly going to look at is higher education as a public good. In the context of increasing privatization of higher education and the commercialization of higher education to which Divya referred. And then the sixth trend, I think, is very, very interesting. Audrey Waters speak about the unbundling and the unmooring of higher education, that things are changing and we're not quite sure where we're heading. Now we're going to look just quickly in detail to these six trends. Let's return to the first one, the impact of technology. Are we facing a new digital divide where most people have access, but do we consider the cost of access to what resources students will have access, and do they have the skills and the literacies to engage with what they find on the internet? The second thing that technology impacts on is what is a course? There's so many open educational resources. What do we offer? What is our higher education's value contribution that is different from what is already out there? And what are the ethical issues in that? The third aspect is who teaches the course? Suddenly the teacher can sit in a different context and on a different continent. What are his or her framework of teaching, her pedagogies, her epistemologies, and the way she or he engages and sees the world? A case in point is the recent debates on massive open online courses where we see that it's already people with degrees, with access to technology, people with social capital, now also accessing this free online open courses. The second trend I mentioned is a changing in funding and regulatory regimes. If we consider that funding increasingly follows performance rather than precedes it. Funding becomes a steering mechanism to obtain certain goals. The issue and the ethical consideration is who determines these goals. The third trend I mentioned is the issue of massification of higher education. Education is a human right. So if we open up the doors of higher education, do we have an ethical responsibility to care for those that we've allowed access to? How do we support them? So what are the ethical constraints in opening up higher education? The fourth trend in higher education that impacts and shapes our ethical discussions, and that's the role and the impact of different stakeholders. How do we ensure that those new players in the field, as well as the established players, conform to ethical guidelines and rules? How do we ensure that we balance local, national, international? So there's issues with regard to the range and the variety of stakeholders in distance education and higher education and e-learning. The fifth trend, and the second last one, is higher education as a public good. If we accept that higher education is a moral good, is a moral practice, we have a duty to offer spaces for engagement on higher education level. The last trend that I would like to identify before closing is the unbundling or the unmooring of higher education. Audrey Waters in her article refers specifically to the massive open online phenomenon, but then she takes it further to say that if we find it that someone outside of an higher education institution develops a curricula, someone else develops the institutional virtual learning environment, someone else assesses, someone else provides the support. What is happening? How do we ensure that an ethical agreement between these different stakeholders in providing what we accredit then? So while higher education is facing a fluid time, and where there are aspects of unbundling and unmooring, we have to consider what are the ethical implications of all of this. We may find that we will continue to look for a center that holds. In each specific context, we don't have the answers, but hopefully our discussions and the pointers and the trends we've discussed in this series will help you to reconsider your own assumptions and your institution's assumptions about the issues of ethics in higher education.